So, you know, we did
Yeah, we're
those.
going to talk.
Oh, we're here in the studio again. We're trying to have a private moment, but the kids sneak in and start recording us. It must be time for Comm Chat.
Comm Chat, those comm students, darn it, they're everywhere.
So I'm Ralph Merkel.
I'm Mary Ashlock.
Joining us today is Dr. Scott Sanders, a now in your third year member of the Comm faculty. And one of the things we try to do is introduce people that we haven't done these videos with before. Tell us a little bit about what you're teaching and what you were doing before you got to Louisville.
Well, right now I'm teaching the communication technologies and the research methods courses. And the last year I taught social media. And so in general what that is, it's kind of a review of the history of communication technologies as well as the social impact of these technologies. And when I teach social media, we look a little bit at the economic models of social media, because teaching about the technologies themselves, they change so quickly that unless we think about kind of some of the underlying concepts that structure how people use them, it doesn't really become informative after a year. You're out of college. A year later, it's no longer useful to you. So.
As we know, in Comm Chat, we used to shoot with studio cameras. Now we're using Nikon DSLRs.
Very nice
and
cameras,
thanks,
I might
Nikon.
add.
I always give them a shout out because we've got lots of
Yes.
Nikon equipment here. But as the people who are in the studio can attest to, everything doesn't always work perfectly because we're shooting about 30 minutes after we're supposed to start. So technologically, we thought we had our ducks in the row, but a couple ducks were not marching for us.
And it evolves, as you're saying. So you're looking at the social impact, economic impact of it all.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of these things where the technology itself is not really a stable factor, right? And so one of the things that I encourage my students to think about, and I encourage people when they're doing research papers, graduate students, et cetera, is to think not necessarily about a particular social media platform, but about the variables contained within that platform, the sorts of affordances and limitations of a platform that allow it to be distinctive, right? And what I mean by that is what you can do with the platform versus what you can't do with the platform. Because the Facebook today does not look like Facebook, 3 years ago or 5 years ago or last year, right? And so we have to think about how it's changing and what are the granular sorts of aspects of these technologies that we can actually make inferences about.
And your background, as far as before you got here to the University of Louisville, your interest was in this type of stuff?
My interest started out in this type of stuff. So as an undergrad, I was looking at how people strategically used communication technologies in interpersonal relationships. And that moved me in the direction of pursuing a master's and a PhD. I got my master's at Purdue, where I looked at mobile phone usage amongst Chinese students. I did field research in Beijing, China, where I did interviews with Chinese students. And then in Los Angeles, I was at the Annenberg School of Communication, where I worked on a number of projects, but my dissertation dealt with how people evaluate user-generated content in online forums.
And what do they like user-generated content?
Well, it wasn't
trusted as much.
Well, it was more of an issue of trust, right? The idea was, how do you make a decision about whether or not to trust what someone posts online? And so one of the questions that I was trying to answer is do we trust displays of competence versus displays or what other people say about us? So does it matter what you say about me, or does it matter what I can demonstrate I can do, right? And at least in the experiments that I conducted, it showed that, actually it mattered more what other people said, and it probably has something to do with how motivated we are to evaluate the claims an individual makes. But going into it with very little at stake, people tend to trust other people rather than closely evaluate the performance of an individual.
Interesting. So given that, and now as you move forward, where are you seeing the studies going, especially as we add more platforms and look at that whole, to me, my background is organizational interpersonal.
Okay.
So I'm fascinated with that. Where are we going? Are we going to be able to talk with one another?
We'll have Comm Snapchat
yeah.
instead of Comm Chat.
Which is great. I'm thinking of the younger generations coming up. I have teenagers, and everybody's texting, breaking up the same old thing we hear about. But I keep wondering, where are we going with that?
Well, as a field in communication, I think that we've traditionally relied upon traditional social scientific methods, so surveys and experiments. But we're actually entering into this really interesting period in social science where collecting data about problems is actually not the real problem, right? We can get tons and tons of data. The ability is to gather and structure that data in a way that actually allows us to make inferences. So, previously, whereas if you had a few thousand people, that might be a very large data set. But when we are talking about social media, you can have hundreds of thousands or even millions of people that you're dealing with. And so collecting that data and being able to come up with ways to analyze it and to structure it, to answer the questions that we're interested in, I think is ultimately going to be the future of our field. So that's some of the sorts of things that I have been trying to push forward in my research and to use for the projects that I'm working on here.
One last question, and this has always interested me because I think it's sort of, in my opinion, it's a bit of an echo chamber. What do you think about Twitter? Is Twitter something that is as widespread as Twitter would like us to believe, or is Twitter the media talking to other media, listening to other media? Is it as all-encompassing as they would like us to think?
Well, I mean, so there's a couple things going on there. The first is that when we're talking about these sorts of big media events where people are discussing these news stories online, what we do find is that the traditional media is controlling the conversation to a very large degree, right? Doesn't ever mean that that the average user isn't engaging in some sort of agenda-setting function, but it does seem like these organizations are kind of pushing things forward. The other thing about Twitter, though, that we have to bear in mind is that a huge majority of a large number of the accounts on Twitter actually aren't real people. Yeah. They're not even organizations, right? They're bots. And so when we study when we study Twitter, we have to ask ourselves, are we studying people or are we studying an algorithm, right? Because for the most part, we're usually interested in making inferences about how people behave and the choices that people make, whether they choose to share this or that. But if that's being controlled by an algorithm of some sort, then what we're really doing is studying the algorithm. And so that's one of the primary issues, I think, that when we as researchers address Twitter data, we have to think about what we're actually doing.
So we should not be as proud of our retweets, because they could be just a bunch of algorithms retweeting us.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's not so much that. You can think about it more along the lines of a gatekeeping or agenda setting function, right? Where the information that you're being presented with for your consumption has been predetermined by the algorithm. And so you're only going to retweet the sorts of things that you're presented with. And so it does, it does potentially create an echo chamber, or at least influence people's behavior and choices in a way that may not be entirely apparent to them, transparent, when they actually engage with it. So.
Could be powerful with the influence. Well, it's certainly powerful.
Yeah.
With everything you've talked about, the different platforms.
Speaking of power, we have to power down.
Power down. It's been fascinating.
It has, and we welcome you back for future discussions about this. Welcome to the University of Louisville. This is your third year. Welcome to Comm Chat, and retweet us.
Yes,
we'll see you next time.
All right.